Among aficionados of SNL, Show 4 is widely seen as an important turning point, the moment when the format gelled and everything began to coalesce into the show we all know. This is a slight oversimplification. While Show 4 is definitely the first to place a strong emphasis on the not ready for primetime players, over the course of season 1 there'd be plenty of episodes where the show would get dangerously close to returning to the host-dominated paradigm of the first 3 weeks. I think the difference here is Candice Bergen's lack of ego and her willingness to go along with the ideas put forward by the writers, compared to some of the bigger stars Lauren convinced to host that first year. In November 1975, Bergen was fresh off a minor success with her role in the western Bite the Bullet, but was hardly a superstar. She'd modeled for Vogue and been in a few movies, but she was by far the least known host to that point, as famous for her family name as for her film work. Frankly, she most likely got the gig because of the mutual friendship between herself, director Mike Nichols, with whom Bergen had worked, and Lorne Michaels. In any event, Bergen's relative lack of experience meant that she didn't feel entitled to demand a large role in the show, which seemingly led the writers to step up and deliver their strongest material up to that point. For her part, Bergen is quoted as saying about the first time hosting SNL, Lorne Michaels said that the expression in my eyes when the show started was like Patty Hearst when the Symbionese Liberation Army rang her doorbell. You just have to hang on for dear life. It's brilliantly run, but it's a miracle that show could have ever existed. The demands are so insane. In other words, you kind of have to go along or you'll be swept away. We'll see that happen a few times this season, actually, to hosts who are unwilling to acquiesce the way Bergen did. Bergen introduces musical guest Esther Phillips as someone I very much wanted to have on the show, lending some weight to what has always been assumed, that hosts had more of a say in picking the support act in the early days. The theory is that Lorne would dangle the carrot of choosing their own music guest as an incentive to help convince any hosts who might be on the fence about taking the job. Bergen would have another African-American woman as her guest later in the season, and her character Murphy Brown would go on to be a big fan of Motown-style R&B music in the vein of Esther Phillips. That's a neat facet of Candice Bergen's personality that she's sort of injected into her personal life, and I love it. That said, Esther Phillips' voice is definitely an acquired taste. She has a sort of over-exaggerated vibrato that I find incredibly distracting. It's hard to tell how much of it is purposeful affectation versus just the natural timbre of her voice, but it does a disservice to the material in my opinion. The first song is a 70s-tastic disco rendition of the Dinah Washington classic, What a Difference a Day Makes, played at cocaine tempo and full of wah-wah pedal and bongo drums. I can't say I love it. Phillips closes the episode with I Can Stand a Little Rain, which I greatly prefer to her first number. The Mama Goat vibrato is still a bit much, but it suits the material better. Andy Kaufman's Foreign Man character gets his SNL debut. He'd performed similar routines in clubs and on the Dick Van Dyke variety shows earlier in the year, but this particular performance is widely seen as giving Andy the boost in popularity that led to the producers of Taxi taking an interest in him for the role of Latka Gravas. The sketch has been cited as an early example of cringe humor, which relies on making the audience feel uncomfortable. The foreign man comes out and bombs horribly in his attempt at telling jokes, breaks down into a nervous fit, and then transitions that fit into a wildly gesticulating bongo song and dance routine. The humor lies 100% in Kaufman's wonderful performance. He totally sells the authenticity of the character, making him almost believable, even though the portrayal has very little depth or resemblance to any actual ethnicity. He also manages to really nail his own breakdown when he forgets his material and starts freaking out. The audience is right there following him the whole time, eating it up, no idea what's next, and it's really something to watch. When he gets to the punchline, the dance at the end, there's the same delightful audience reaction as in the Mighty Mouse routine where they get it and break into applause, and it's terrific. Nobody before or since has done what Andy Kaufman did. Why would they, and how could they? It's totally original. Albert Brooks's film this week is a showcase of NBC's mid-season replacement series. It was fairly common, especially on networks that were struggling to secure primetime advertising, to pull poorly performing shows before they'd even finished their first season. With a few notable exceptions, the shows brought in to replace such failed series rarely lasted longer than what they had replaced. That being the case, Brooks presents us with 3 not exactly scintillating ideas for NBC's lackluster lineup. The highlight for me is The Three of Us, in which Brooks none too subtly tries to convince his wife to have a menage a trois with the roommate. The producers of Three's Company must have seen this and thought, the only thing this concept needs is Don Knotts, and we struck comedy gold, because that show totally aped this premise and became a huge hit on ABC just over a year after this film aired. I kind of wonder what Albert Brooks must have thought of that. This is the best of Brooks's films so far, if you ask me. There's some smart and subtle humor here, and the parodies of 70s TV ring true to what I've seen of the period. Chevy's phone cold open is a "she's late" joke. Can't even get her name right, he's such a cad. We have the first "I'm Chevy Chase and you're not" introduction. They'd iterate on this all season long to varying results, but this catchphrase, along with his name being announced every single week alongside the update segment, contributed to the other players, especially Belushi's, animosity toward Chase's perceived arrogance about his greater notoriety on the show. This week in topical humor, Ford is still clumsy, Rockefeller refuses to run with him, Liz Taylor gets a damn cheetah for her birthday, and vandals attach arms to the Venus de Milo. In a good example of the show's willingness to break the fourth wall, Chevy makes a sexist Bella Abzug period joke, then gets pretty meta when he accuses his own gag of being a lazy rewrite of a Jack Carter line from years ago. This week sees the introduction of a recurring update gag. Contributor Jane Curtin delivers an editorial reply to an earlier piece, and Chevy mocks her mercilessly behind her back. Chevy's pretty darn good at stealing focus, I'll give him that. It's not usually looked at as a strength in an actor. And finally, we have another of Garrett's news for the hard of hearing closers, which just debuted the prior week. SNL's always been pretty willing to repeat a strong gag, even early on, but they usually don't repeat it the very next episode. This week we have the world's least subtle environmentalist allegory, in which the hungry King Plubis insists the queen kill one of the last two remaining gligs for him to eat, even though this will mean they can never mate and produce more gligs. The sheer laziness of this conceit is enough to make it painfully clear that nobody had any interest in putting forward good material for the Muppets, even this early in the game. It's a largely laugh-free 5 minutes. I still haven't gotten used to hearing Fozzie the Bear's voice come out of this thing, though.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
This week's cold open sees Chevy impersonate President Gerald Ford for the first time. It's not as strong as other later Ford sketches, but it's groundbreaking nonetheless. I'm unaware of any earlier instance of a postmodern impression like Chevy's no-effort Ford here, where he made no real attempt to mimic the voice or mannerisms of the celebrity he's impersonating, other than clumsiness. By all means, correct me in the comments if I'm wrong. Of course, SNL would go on to showcase many talented impressionists such as Dana Carvey, Phil Hartman, and Daryl Hammond, whose impressions actually tried to evoke the folks they imitated. It bears mentioning, though, how brazenly strange it was in 1975 to air such an abstract depiction of a well-known political figure. Basically, the Nixon tapes, the sketch, this advertisement riffs on the administration's practice of exchanging prime ambassadorships for political contributions, as reported by the Washington Post. Timely for 1975, but not exactly side-splitting today. Aykroyd portrays a beleaguered CIA records employee searching for Garrett Morris's file to comply with a Freedom of Information Act request. In an attempt to give Aykroyd more information to help him find it, Garrett inadvertently confesses to like 50 felonies, including assassination and conspiring to riot. Aykroyd acts as if he can't be bothered to even take note of any of it because his office is in such a mess. I guess FOIA has been hard on these folks, right? Anyway, Garrett leaves in disgust, at which point Danny leaps into action and starts an investigation against him. It's a cute premise, a good length, and Danny and Garrett are great in it. This sketch is a good example of the general improvement in quality of the material the players were given to work with beginning this week. The famous land shark makes his debut here in a sublimely silly sequel to the recent movie Jaws. This smooth talker somehow manages to charm his way into Gilda, Lorraine's, and Jane's apartments and eat them, but host Candice is too smart. Thanks to news announcer Don Pardo's helpful report, she knows the key to repelling the beast. Unfortunately, instead of the land shark, she mistakenly clubs poor Jehovah's Witness Garrett, who's merely trying to deliver a copy of Watchtower. It's rightly considered a classic, and became one of the first recurring character sketches. Chevy performs the famous monologue from Macbeth, obviously reading his lines from the skull he holds in his hand. Oops, he dropped it. He stumbles and stammers a bit without his notes, then launches directly into what is possibly the strangest thing in the entire episode, an honest-to-God, not a parody, real-life advertisement for Polaroid cameras and film. This was a scheme Lorne and the network cooked up to provide a little extra income both for the show and for the featured players. Turns out Candice Bergen, a model before her film career, was the spokesperson for Polaroid cameras, and 4 of these would be shot over the course of season 1 of the show before the idea was quietly dropped. We'll see them a few times again in later episodes, but the biggest issue would prove to be audience confusion. Basically, in a show full of parodies of advertisements, people didn't expect an actual advertisement, and they kept waiting for a punchline that would never come. A not very politically correct parody advertisement portraying a gay man placing a long-distance phone call to his mother. Through the lens of 2021, I can't really decide if this one is laughing at or with the gay people, but the final tagline, "the next best thing to being her," referring to the man's mother, makes it tough to defend its intent. On one hand, merely seeing a gay couple on TV in the 70s seems forward-looking. On the other hand, they're treated as one-dimensional stereotypes. Either way, it's not exactly side-splitting. Host Bergen is Catherine Deneuve, in a parody of a Chanel ad Deneuve had recently done. Here's another example of Candice working so well as a host because she's willing to just go along with any silly-ass idea the writers throw at her. In the end, we discover the bottle upon which she's been artistically framed is actually stuck to the side of her damn face. Silly, like I said, but it works because she lets it work. In this stage piece, Gilda confesses to Candice that she often feels insecure in the presence of beautiful women, and Candice does her best to comfort Gilda. It's light on jokes and just relies on the two ladies' personalities as they talk about unrealistic expectations of femininity. It's kind of sad to hear Gilda talk about being socialized to be such a timid young lady, but it's nice to hear Candice reassure her. They also work in some not-so-subtle shade at uninformed voters who'd been tricked into believing the Equal Rights Amendment would mandate co-ed restrooms. Your daily reminder that conservatives have been using the same tired bathroom tactics to scare American voters for at least half a century. Host Bergen fills Jane Curtin's obligatory TV interviewer role this week, hosting Kiwi trappers Aykroyd and Belushi for a talk about their work. This isn't the strongest material in the world, but Aykroyd and Belushi just work so well together that it hardly matters. It's always a joy seeing them with each other. After some questions for the duo, the skit ends with the two demonstrating their Kiwi trapping technique on Candice, who, it must be stated again, is an absolute champ for putting up with this shit. In a pretty great example of Michael O'Donoghue equating creepy with funny, he cold calls airline employee Lorraine and berates her with a series of graphic bodily threats. Being at work, she, of course, has to just politely thank him. On one level, maybe it's sort of groundbreaking anti-comedy, and that the point of the joke is really that people who lash out like this are just scared bullies hiding behind the anonymity of the telephone and hurling threats and abuse. On the other hand, maybe it's just O'Donoghue hurling threats and abuse because he finds it humorous. That guy hates everybody. In her second go as an interviewer, Candice starts off making polite chit-chat with Belushi as the leader of a generic third-world dictatorship. She leads him to believe the interview will be banal and uneventful, but when the cameras start rolling, she immediately becomes rude and condescending to poor Belushi. She calls him several offensive names, which probably wouldn't air on network TV these days, draws facial hair on him with a marker, burns him with a match, and casually belittles him the way Americans are known to do to people of different cultures. He then becomes irate and threatens to have her executed, at which point Candice immediately frames the entire incident as a power-hungry madman threatening the civil liberties of journalists like myself. There's some pretty sharp cultural critique here, or would be if it wasn't being delivered by John Belushi doing an overly broad comedy Middle Eastern accent. In which Garrett Morris hosts expert and author Jane Curtin for a discussion on Jane's recent book about the urban black experience. He seems quite, surprised to find that Jane is in fact a white lady from a privileged background in Manhattan. His surprise probably stems from Jane's author picture on the back sleeve being of some black lady and not of her. This one's another smart and topical sketch with a point to make about cultural appropriation, which nevertheless seems a little crude and even mildly offensive by today's standards. I could be wrong, but...
Which do you prefer? Black, Afro-American, Negro?
I prefer simply Jungle Bunny.
is another moment I don't think would make it to air these days. In the first of a series, Al Franken and Tom Davis would revisit a few times in Season 1. The two play the hot new video game Pong while discussing various personal topics. This week, Al's nervous about bringing his girlfriend home to meet the parents for Thanksgiving. It's not exactly overstuffed with humor. The final score is 11-4, and turns out Davis already slept with Franken's girl. The end. Still very much the junior writers, Franken and Davis, who came as a 2 for the price of 1 deal, would be stuck mostly doing little pieces like this in the Muppet segments during the first season. Finally, in a wonderfully genuine moment of affection, the cast starts the tradition of joining the host on stage for the closing credits, each presenting Bergen with a single red rose as an appreciation for her hosting work that week. After their uneven and spotty contributions to the first 3 shows, the Not Ready players seem genuinely thankful to Bergen for being such a team player, and it's kind of heartwarming to see how much they clearly adored working with her. Even Chevy seems like he's at peace and enjoying the moment, and it's nice to see everyone in such a good place. That glowing camaraderie would prove short-lived, however, as 2 technical errors seemingly detracted from the triumph that was Week 4. The first was relatively minor and resulted only in some slightly bruised egos. Only half of the Not Ready for Primetime players were credited in the introduction this week to a cue card mishap. Basically, the names had previously all been on 1 placard, and in Week 4 they moved them to 2 placards, but only displayed the first one. This meant that only half the cast was actually credited, certainly a showbiz faux pas. The second tech error had a greater, if also temporary, consequence. Lorne Michaels actually resigned as producer of the show. Yeah, on episode 4. The impetus for this resignation was another technical gaffe, this time by an engineer at NBC's flagship affiliate in New York, WNBC-TV. Rather than run the Ambassador Training Institute parody advertisement early in the episode, the engineer cut to an actual local sponsored advertisement instead. Now, this probably happened at one affiliate or another on a semi-regular basis. The parody ads were, after all, intended to look like the real deal, and it was a live broadcast. But this mistake was made right here in New York and on the monitors in Studio 8H for all to notice. And when it was pointed out to Lorne, he flew into a rage and walked out. If you put yourself in Lorne's shoes, you can kind of see why he felt the need to take a stand at this juncture. He knew he was trying to do something both novel and technically challenging with very little room for error. The Bergen episode had already started 15 minutes late due to a longer than usual movie of the week. In his mind, if he didn't stand up to NBC's perceived indifference to the show, it was destined to fail. He'd quit again the next week, in fact, when the network balked at the salary of the lighting and sound engineer Lorne had employed on the first 4 shows, insisting on a cheaper replacement for Week 5. All told, Lorne hardly worked on episode 5 at all, spending most of the week playing poker and trying to prove to NBC that the show couldn't be done cheaply and couldn't be done without his input. Of course, in the end, his gambit worked and his point was proved. The Lorne-less episode 5 with Robert Klein hosting is considered by most to be a backward step from the Bergen show, and it would be a few weeks before they return to the level of quality on display here. Stay tuned.